Arizona Territory, October 1877. The moon hung low and orange over the desert, and Kenzie Dearing was running for her life. Her bare feet were cut on the gravel and cactus spines, her dress torn from barbed wire she had not seen in the dark. But she kept going. Every breath hurt. Every step cracked open something deeper inside. Behind her, the ranch house she had fled was nothing but a shadow against the night, and the man she had married by force and fear was too drunk to follow yet. But he would. He always did. Kenzie had waited until the bottle took him down for good. She had packed nothing. There had not been time. She knew the land well enough to know it was 15 miles to the next ranch, and she would walk every one of them if it meant being free of Clayton Bodie. By the time the stars shifted above and the chill set in, she was stumbling. Her lips were cracked, her legs trembled. Still, she walked. She had no idea she was being watched. About a mile east, a young cowboy named Kade Nolan was riding back from a cattle check, his horse moving slow under the weight of sleep and dust. He had not expected to see anything but jackrabbits and shadows until he spotted the figure in the dark, small, barefoot, and bleeding. He pulled the reins. "Whoa there, girl. Easy," he whispered to his mare, then dismounted, boots crunching soft on the dry dirt. The woman flinched when he approached, backing away like a half-broken colt. "Hey now," he said, holding both hands up. "I ain't gonna hurt you. You look like hell, miss." Kenzie blinked at him, her body swaying. She looked ready to collapse. "Please," she rasped, "do not take me back." He stepped closer, slow and careful. Back where? Her eyes filled. Clayton Bodie's ranch. Cade's jaw tensed. He knew that name. Everyone in this part of the territory did. A man with too much land, too much liquor, and not a speck of decency. "You his wife." Kenzie nodded once, lips trembling. "Not anymore," Kade said. "Come on, I got a horse. I will get you safe." She stared at him like she could not quite believe it. Then her knees buckled. Kade caught her before she hit the ground. He wrapped his coat around her, lifted her up slow, and got her onto the mare like she was made of glass. Once they were both mounted, he guided the horse toward his place, a quiet ranch tucked behind the hills, hidden from the roads and the reach of men like Bodie. She did not speak again before they reached it. By the time the sun started rising red and gold over the horizon, they were riding into the yard. Kenzie stirred in the saddle, her head resting against Cade's chest. "You got a name?" he asked gently. She looked up at him through lashes heavy with dust. "Kenzie, Kade Nolan," he said. "You are safe now," she whispered. "Thank you." He helped her down, carried her inside. The house was small but warm, clean, and quiet. She did not ask questions. She just sat on the edge of the bed he offered her, her hands shaking as they gripped the quilt. Kade brought her water, then left her alone to rest. He did not ask anything more. By mid-morning, she had fallen asleep. And Kade stood in the doorway, looking at her like he had never seen something so breakable. Or so brave. He had known women before in town, on the trail, but none of them had looked at him like she had in the dark. Like she had nothing left to give and still offered trust. When she woke in the afternoon, her voice was stronger. "You live alone?" she asked. "Just me. I got a few hands, but they are out on cattle runs most days." Kenzie looked around. "It is quiet here." "You can stay as long as you need," Kade said. She looked at him for a long time. "Why are you being kind to me?" Kade leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Because someone should have been kind to you a long time ago." Kenzie's throat worked, but she said nothing. That night she helped him feed the horses, even though her feet were still bandaged. She smiled when his mare nudged her shoulder, and Kade saw the first crack of light in her face. Over the next 2 days, she did not ask for anything. She just helped sweeping, cooking what little they had, mending a shirt of his with thread she found in the drawer. Kade noticed everything. The way she still flinched at loud sounds. The way she curled her hands under the table to stop them from shaking. But she laughed a little when he told her a story about a runaway calf, and it was the softest sound he had ever heard. On the 4th day, she was standing by the corral when he walked up beside her. She was barefoot still, the dress she had borrowed tied up at the waist. "You ever think about leaving Arizona?" he asked. Kenzie looked at him. "Every day." I could take you north, Colorado maybe, or Montana. I hear there are good folks out that way. She hesitated. You would do that for me? I would do anything for you, he said, voice low. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched someone without fear in years. Kade did not let go. That night they sat by the fire and she leaned against his shoulder. Do you believe in second chances? She asked. He turned his head, eyes catching the firelight. I do now. Kenzie looked up at him. You caught me before I could fall. You ran, he said. I just made sure you did not have to run alone anymore. She smiled, and something in her face softened. He leaned in, slow and careful. She met him halfway. The kiss was quiet, but it changed everything. By the time the stars came out, she was curled up beside him, her head on his chest, his arm around her back, like they had always belonged that way. Kenzie had escaped a terrible marriage on foot, and before dawn broke that first night, a kindly cowboy had caught her heart. By the end of the week, the desert wind had shifted, carrying the bite of November. Kade had brought in an old wool cloak from the back of a storage trunk and laid it wordlessly by Kenzie's chair. She'd run her fingers over the stitching but hadn't put it on until the sun fell. When she did, she didn't look at him but her shoulders eased, and that was answer enough. The ranch sat in a shallow basin, bordered by thorn scrub and dry creeks. The cattle grazed further west, driven out to better pasture by the two hired hands who returned only for supplies. In their absence, the house kept quiet, a pocket of stillness tucked far from the reach of questions. One morning, Kenzie stepped out to tend the hens. She hadn't asked if she could, just slipped on the boots Kade left by the door and went. He found her kneeling in the dust, coaxing a stubborn Rhode Island red back into the coop. You ever keep livestock before? He asked, resting his hip on the fence rail. I'd rather deal with hens than men, she said without looking up. Kade chuckled low in his throat. Guess hens don't talk back. I didn't say they were easier, just quieter. He watched her for a moment, then asked, You planning on staying long? Kenzie stood, brushing straw from her skirt. Is that your way of asking me to go? No, ma'am. That's my way of asking if I should plant more winter squash. Her eyes flicked to his, and for the first time that morning she smiled, but it didn't reach her mouth. It stayed in her eyes, soft and uncertain. Later that day, she found an old ledger on the kitchen shelf, covered in dust. She flipped it open to find pages of supply lists in tight handwriting: flour, salt pork, bullets, feed. The ink was beginning to fade, but the math was steady. She looked up from the page. You do all this yourself? I did, Kade said, setting a bucket by the pump. My older brother helped when he was still alive. After he passed, it was just me. Kenzie ran her fingers along the edge of the paper. You ever think about leaving it behind? He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. Sometimes. But it's the only land I ever called mine. She nodded, then closed the book gently. It's good land. That night she stood by the fire with a needle and thread, mending the torn hem of her borrowed dress. Kade sat nearby, polishing a bridle strap. The silence between them wasn't empty, it held something tentative, waiting. You think a person can forget who they were? She asked, eyes on her work. Kade didn't look up. No, but I think they can decide what comes next. Kenzie paused, thread between her fingers. What if they've been made small for so long they don't know how to be anything else? He set down the leather strap, hands resting on his knees. Then they start by sitting at their own table, wearing their own name. She glanced at him then, her face unreadable. You make it sound simple. It's not, but it's worth doing. The next morning she rose before the sun. Kade had saddled the roan mare, saddle blanket dusted with frost. He watched her from the porch, coffee steaming in his hand. I want to ride with you, she said. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and handed her the reins. They rode in silence, past the edge of the basin and into the low hills. The sun broke slow through the clouds, turning the mesquite golden. They didn't speak until they reached a stand of cottonwoods near the dry riverbed. Kenzie dismounted first, her boots crunching over brittle leaves. I buried something here, she said. A long time ago. Kade stayed beside her, not asking. My father taught me how to shoot here before he died. She touched the bark of the nearest tree, her voice steady. He wasn't a gentle man, but he kept me safe. Kade rested his hand against the tree beside hers. Sounds like he gave you something worth carrying, she nodded, blinking once. I wanted to remember I had that before everything else. He didn't speak. Just stood beside her until the wind pulled at the edges of her cloak and the sun rose higher through the branches. By the time they returned to the ranch, her cheeks were flushed from the cold and her hands no longer shook when she dismounted. That evening, she brought out 2 plates. Venison and beans. She had cooked without asking. Kade took the first bite, then looked at her. This is good. I know, she said, and this time the smile found its way to her mouth. They ate by the fire, neither hurrying. When the meal was done, she gathered the plates, but he stopped her with a hand on hers. You don't have to keep proving yourself. I'm not, she said, curling her fingers around his. I just like having something to offer. Kade didn't pull away. You already do. She looked down at their hands, then back up. I don't want to leave. Then don't. The fire cracked, and outside the wind shifted again. Kenzie leaned against him, her head resting just beneath his jaw, and for the first time since she crossed the desert on bleeding feet, she felt the ground settle beneath her. The days grew colder, the sky pale and wide above the land that gave nothing without cost. Kenzie began rising early, not out of habit, but because her body had started to trust the rhythm of the place. The weight she carried in her chest was still there, but it no longer pressed down with every breath. It lived beside her now, not inside her. Kade was in the barn splitting kindling when she stepped in, her sleeves rolled past her elbows and a strip of muslin tied around her hair. You said your brother helped you run this place, she said, brushing hay from a saddle tree. What happened to him? Kade didn't stop swinging the hatchet. Typhoid took him, spring of '74, we buried him on the ridge. Kenzie leaned against the stall gate, chin lifted slightly. You never thought about selling the land after that. He set the split wood aside and leaned the axe against the beam. I did, got as far as packing a few things. But I couldn't leave, not because of the land, because of what it cost. She nodded slowly, then crossed to the far tack wall. I've been thinking about mending that second saddle, leather's cracked but the tree's sound. Kade looked up. You planning on taking it out, if I earn it? You don't need to earn anything here. She didn't answer, just ran her hand along the worn horn, her fingers quiet in their motion. That afternoon, she walked the fence line. Kade joined her halfway in, boots crunching over frost-rimmed weeds. He carried a coil of wire and a pair of pliers slung through his belt, the post down near the bends leaning, she said. I saw it. He handed her the wire without a word, and they worked side by side, hands red from the cold. She didn't flinch when the barbs bit her palm, only wrapped the brake tighter. You ever plan on putting up a windmill? She asked as they straightened the post together. Thought about it. Trouble is, the well's shallow. Wouldn't take much to draw it dry. She braced the beam while he packed in the earth. You ever want to farm instead of run cattle? Don't like the way crops die when you look at them wrong. Kenzie gave the faintest laugh. I can grow herbs, nothing big. But there's a way to keep them through winter if you dry them right. Kade tamped the dirt firm, then looked at her. You thinking about staying through winter? She looked down at her hands. I don't feel hunted here. That's not the same as belonging, I know. She met his eyes. But it's a start. That night there was a brittle stillness in the house. Not silence, but the kind of quiet that asked to be broken gently. Kenzie sat by the window with a spool of thread and a strip of calico she'd found in the bottom drawer. She was piecing together a pouch, slow and careful. Kade sat at the table with a ledger open, pencil moving steady across the page. You always write your figures at night? She asked without turning. Only when I want the numbers to look better than they are. She smiled faintly, eyes still on the stitches. I used to keep ledgers. My father taught me, he said numbers don't lie, people do. Smart man, he was, hard but fair. She tied off the thread, then turned in her chair. You ever been in love before? Kade's pencil paused. Once, a girl from Yavapai, she had a laugh like summer. But her folks moved east when the mines dried up. Kenzie nodded. I thought I was in love once, before Clayton. There was a boy who used to bring me river rocks, said they looked like pieces of sky. What happened to him? Joined the cavalry. Never came back. Kade set down the pencil, leaned back in the chair. You think about him still? Only when I see the color blue. They sat a while like that, the fire throwing shadows long across the floorboards. Kade finally asked, Do you miss who you were before? Kenzie folded the cloth between her fingers. I don't remember her well enough to miss, but I think I'd like to meet her again. Maybe she's closer than you think. Kenzie looked at him for a long moment. You always say just enough. Never too much. It's how I was raised. Words were for when you meant them. She stood then, not hurried, and crossed the room. He didn't rise, just waited as she came to stand before him. Do you mean this? She asked, voice level but low. I wouldn't let you stay if I didn't. She reached for his hand, her fingers warmer than they'd been days before. Then I'd like to stay. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow and sure. Then you're home. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, and he closed his eyes. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the promise of frost. But inside the house, the warmth held steady, and neither of them moved for a long time. The frost stayed through morning now, silvering the tops of fence rails and curling the edges of the porch wood. Kenzie had taken to wearing the old cloak even inside while the stove warmed the kitchen slow. She moved quieter than before, but not with fear, with thought. Her steps had purpose now, her stillness a kind of presence rather than a hiding. Kade brought down a crate from the loft over the barn and set it on the table with a dull thud. Dust rose up and caught the morning light. I've been meaning to sort through this before the mice get to it, he said, lifting the lid. Kenzie peered inside. What is it? Ties things. Some of mine from the war, never had much reason to open it. Her fingers hovered just above the edge, then settled lightly on the top layer. A gray wool coat, 2 tin cups, a crumpled letter. She picked up a carved wooden token worn smooth along the edges. Did he make this? Kade nodded. He whittled through the long rides, said it kept his hands from mischief. Kenzie smiled faintly. He sounds like someone I'd have liked. He was steadier than me, made people believe in things. Her hands paused on the letter. You never sent this. No one to send it to after. He reached for the cup and turned it in his hand. I kept it because it still felt like part of something. Kenzie traced the edge of the box, then lifted out the coat. Would it be all right if I cleaned this up? Sewed the hem, he looked at her. You don't have to. I know, I want to. Later, she stood beneath the clothesline with the coat pinned open, brushing the wool with a worn rag. The sun was weak but enough to warm the fabric. Her breath clouded the air, and she watched it drift as she worked. Kade stepped beside her, a coil of rope in one hand. I thought I'd ride out to check the western line. Want to come? She looked over at him. You trust me with the horse? He studied her a moment. You've got steady hands. That's what matters. They rode out as the light stretched long across the flats. She handled the mare carefully, not stiff, not nervous, just attentive. Kade stayed a few lengths ahead, letting her find her rhythm. At the edge of the property, a patch of burnt mesquite marked where a lightning strike had come through 2 summers back. The skeletons of the trees stood black against the pale sky. That came close, she said, pulling the reins gently. Too close. We lost a calf and part of the north fence. Kenzie dismounted, walking a short way into the ash. Clayton once burned a field to punish a man who crossed him, said it'd remind folks who owned the land. Kade stepped up beside her. You don't owe him the memory, I know. Her voice was even. But knowing doesn't clear it. She crouched and picked up a handful of blackened soil. This still grows after a while, doesn't it? Eventually. Takes time. She let the ash fall through her fingers. I've been thinking about planting something, not big, maybe sage or fennel. Something with roots. He looked at her, then out over the land. You pick the spot, I'll bring the tools. That night she brought out a thin book. The cover was cracked leather, the pages inked in a fine looping hand. My mother kept this, she said, setting it on the table. Recipes, remedies, sometimes just thoughts. I found it in my things when I left, slipped into a lining. I think she meant for me to find it one day. Kade turned a page gently. She write all this herself. She died when I was 14. I didn't know she'd written anything down. Kenzie's voice softened. Reading it's like hearing her again. He passed her the book without a word. She opened to a page near the middle. She wrote about a salve for cracked skin, said it worked best when made with bare grease, but lard would do. I used to watch her rub it into Pa's hands after branding season. Kade leaned forward. You remember the smell? Pine and beeswax. I think I could make it again. He reached across the table, his hand closing over hers. Then we'll make it. She didn't pull away. Her fingers folded around his like it was the most natural thing in the world. The stove crackled low behind them. Outside, the wind had stilled. Kenzie looked down at their joined hands. It doesn't feel borrowed anymore, this life. It feels like something I could build. Kade's voice was quiet. With me, she met his eyes. If you'll have me. He stood then, drawing her with him. His arms came around her, firm and sure, and she rested her head just beneath his collarbone. The weight of years settled quiet between them, no longer heavy. They stayed like that as the fire burned low, wrapped in something earned slow and built steady. In the corner, her mother's book waited, open to the page about healing. The first snow came quiet and thin, a veil more than a blanket. Kenzie stood at the window before dawn, arms crossed over her chest, watching it gather against the eaves. She didn't speak, not when Kade brought her coffee in a chipped blue cup, not when the wind picked up and pushed the snow sideways across the yard. She only turned when he stepped beside her and said, "Won't stick long, earth still too warm." She nodded, then set the cup down. "I want to mark the garden spot today, before the ground gets too hard." Kade pulled on his coat. "I'll fetch the stakes." They worked in silence, side by side, measuring the patch near the south fence where the sun lingered longest. Kenzie drove in the stakes herself, hands steady on the mallet. Her aim was sharp, precise. Kade watched her without comment, only held the string taut as she looped it from post to post. "There's wild yarrow along the dry creek," she said after a while. "I could transplant some. Helps with fever and it'll root if I set it before the freeze." He nodded once. "I'll walk with you." They left before noon, the snow already melting into the dry grass. Kenzie carried a small spade tucked into her belt. Kade kept his rifle slung low, not for fear, just habit. They passed the ridge where Ty was buried, the stones still undisturbed, and headed into the narrow draw where water once ran. Kenzie knelt beneath a low juniper and brushed aside a mat of leaves. A small cluster of yarrow pushed pale and stubborn through the frost-bitten soil. "Still holding on," she said softly. She dug carefully, cupping the root ball with both hands. Kade laid his coat down so she could wrap it safe for the walk back. As they crested the hill, she asked, "Do you ever hear from your folks? They passed when I was just out of the army." "Fever got them both same week." "I'm sorry," he shook his head. "They were good to the end." Kenzie looked down at the bundle in her arms. "I don't have anyone left either, no letters, no names." Kade stopped walking. "You've got me." She met his eyes. "I know." They planted the yarrow that afternoon, just before the sun dipped low. Kenzie pressed the soil firm around the roots, then sat back on her heels. "I want to build a bench here," she said, "so I can sit and watch it grow come spring. I'll saw the planks tomorrow." That night, Kade lit a lantern and brought down a tin of molasses from the shelf. Kenzie raised an eyebrow as he opened the lid. "Thought we'd try making those biscuits you talked about," he said. She laughed once, quiet but full. "You'll need lard and a steady hand. I've got both." They worked by firelight, hands brushing now and then over flour and dough. When the biscuits came out, rough-edged and golden, she broke one open and handed him half. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then nodded. "You sure you didn't used to own a boarding house?" She smacked his arm with the edge of her apron. "Don't insult me." He caught her wrist, held it gently. "I'd marry you for these." Kenzie froze, then pulled her hand back slowly. "You mean that?" He set the biscuit down. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." She folded the towel over the pan and leaned against the counter. I've been someone's wife before, but I've never been someone's choice. You're mine, because I see you, not for what you survived. For what you are, she stepped closer, voice low. Then ask me. He didn't kneel, he didn't need to. Kenzie Dearing, will you stay here with me, build something that lasts? She nodded, eyes bright. Yes, I want that. They didn't sleep apart that night, not for warmth, but for closeness. He held her with both arms, and she laid her hand over his heart. The next day, Kade rode into town. He came back with a preacher and a ring carved from scrap iron, shaped by the blacksmith who owed him a favor. Kenzie wore her mother's shawl, and the yarrow bloomed oddly early at her feet. They were married by the garden stakes, with the mare and 2 hens as witness. They didn't speak vows beyond what was needed. They'd said what mattered already. Kade built the bench the following week. He carved their initials into the underside where only she would ever see. Winter deepened, but the house stayed warm in time the garden grew. Fennel, yarrow, sage, and late summer beans. Kenzie bottled salves and lined the shelves with jars. Kade added a second corral and started raising a pair of oxen for plow work. They never spoke of the road she walked to get there. It lived behind her, not beside her. When she laughed now, it came from her belly, full and unguarded. When he touched her, it was never rushed. They slept with the windows cracked in spring so they could hear the coyotes sing. They read from her mother's book by lamplight. Her hands never shook again. In the end, it wasn't survival that defined them. It was the choosing. The slow, quiet decision to stay, to build, to love without fear, and they did, for the rest of their long, good days.